Hi, everybody. Great to see you. If the panelists want to show themselves, that'd be great. And we'll get started in just a couple minutes. Thank you. Oh, there you are. Look, there they are. It's like magic. Pop, pop. And for those of you who haven't been on one of my briefings before, welcome. We have the panelists show themselves and everybody else is on mute and without video so that we can make sure that it is easy to see who is speaking. So thank you. Okay. Beth on. I think we're just waiting for Beth and then we'll get started. So why don't we wait one more minute to let more folks are hopping on. So we'll wait one more minute and get started. Thanks. If you have questions or thoughts, then feel free to put them in the chat box as we proceed through, through today's presentations. Thank you. Great. Welcome everybody. Great to see you. Thanks for joining us today. We have a great group of people who are going to be speaking to us today about the future of public transit. An incredibly important topic that you all are experts on and have different viewpoints on. And so I'm thrilled to be here today with our speakers. My name is Delegate Brooke Learman, and I represent with my teammates, Senator Ferguson and Delegates Robin Lewis and Luke Clippinger, District 46 in Baltimore City. And of course, although we represent District 46 in Baltimore City, we do work at the statewide level. And I have worked for many years as a pro-public transit advocate with many of the folks on the call today. So I'm happy to be sharing this time and space with you. Before we begin, I just want to make a few points about why I think it's so important to host events like this and where we are today. You know, as an elected official, it is very important that we pass legislation, but it's just as important that we connect people to the resources that they need and that we drive discussions about important topics and advocate for change in many ways, including through discussions like this one. Government is really about reducing barriers and creating opportunities for all, and transit is absolutely about reducing barriers and creating opportunities, connecting communities and building a connected and thriving and prosperous state. Over the past few months, public transportation has played an absolutely critical role in our, let's see, I'm gonna mute folks, has played an absolutely critical role in making sure that we are moving, our essential workers are moving around successfully and getting to their hospitals, their jobs. And one thing I like to make a point of saying at all of these webinars is that we are really lucky because we today are in our safe spaces, in our homes, and maybe some of us are in safe offices, but our frontline workers are the ones who have kept our economy going. And first and foremost, that includes our transit workers. Our transit workers have not had a day off. They have continued to work throughout this whole pandemic to keep our economy moving, to get other essential workers who I'm so grateful for, like our healthcare workers and our grocery store workers around the state. But at the same time that we've recognized how important public transit is to our economy and to our essential jobs and businesses, the funding sources for public transportation have been depleted because of the severe decrease in ridership and driving and gas usage. So there are many, many challenges on the horizon for public transit: funding, ensuring equity, ensuring sustainability and safety and efficiency. Some of these issues were created by COVID, but mostly they were just crystallized or expanded because of COVID. For instance, the capital needs inventory, which MTA released last year and showed that MTA has a deferred maintenance backlog of over $1 billion for its state of good repair needs. That funding cliff will be even harder to overcome now that we have less money in the Transportation Trust Fund. So to discuss the funding and the safety and sustainability of public transit today, I am so thrilled to welcome 4 amazing speakers who will all come at this from different angles. So I'm really excited to hear from them. So we have Beth Osborne, who is the Director of Transportation for America. She was previously at the US DOT, where she served as the Acting Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy and as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy starting in 2009. We're also going to hear from Joe McAndrew, who has more than a decade of policy and planning experience. He's the Managing Director for Transportation Policy at the Greater Washington Partnership, where he develops and drives all activity relating to the partnership's transportation initiatives. Also, Dr. Celeste Chavez, who's an associate professor in the Department of Transportation and Urban Infrastructure Studies in the School of Engineering at the great Morgan State University right here in Baltimore City. Her research interests include traffic operations, public transportation systems, policy and regulatory decisions, sustainability, and equity of transportation systems. And also, finally, Regina Sullivan. So grateful that you could join us today. Regina is the Managing Director of Government Relations and Policy at the Washington Area Metropolitan Transit Authority, a name that I never say in full, WMATA. In that role, she oversees federal, state, and local government relations for the second largest transit system in the United States. So thrilled to have you all here today. We are going to hear from each of them, and then at the end, we're going to leave some time for Q&A. So if you have questions, we did share all of the questions that people sent in with the panelists so that they could hopefully incorporate some of those questions in their remarks. We also try to get to some of those questions at the end, and if additional people have other questions or you want to highlight one of the questions that you sent in, you can also share that in the chat. So I am going to turn it over to Beth Osborne to kick things off from a national perspective and give us an overview of nationally of transit and next steps with a federal outlook. So thank you so much for being here today, all of you. And Beth, the floor is yours. The screen is yours.
Thanks for having me. I don't have to take up the screen as I'm not going to be presenting slides. I started my career on Capitol Hill, and it's a very anti-PowerPoint environment, yes, which lives on in my heart. But thanks for having me. I'm the Director of Transportation for America. We're a national nonprofit that is focused on connecting people to jobs and opportunity by multiple modes of travel, no matter their financial means or their physical ability. We do our work through policy development and advocacy, through analysis and reporting on how the current system, transportation system is, or in many cases is not functioning, and through direct technical assistance with those that want to improve their systems. In terms of what we've been following in transit, there's 3 general areas. There is the COVID-19 response for transit. There is the trends for transit going forward, and there's federal legislation. So starting with COVID-19, back in March, we started reading articles about how the federal government was considering sending all of its workers home. Something that didn't happen for a little bit or from the administration's orders as quickly as the article indicated it would. But it occurred to many of us that that would be devastating for transit. Just government shutdowns, which affect a far smaller swath of the population, had caused a lot of trouble. And this would be much bigger. And then I started talking with my colleagues in Seattle, and they were already experiencing it. And the articles from MTA in New York were showing a lot of the damage done to transit funds by the closure in New York. So we started working with Congress on coming up with some operational support, and they provided $25 billion in one of the COVID relief packages known as the CARES Act, which was really unprecedented in federal policy. We didn't provide this kind of national assistance for transit operations in the Recovery Act. And there's always been a bright line between transit operations funding and transit capital at the federal level, with the notion that the feds will pay to build stuff, but it's up to the states and the locals to operate it and maintain it. That was true in the Recovery Act, where transit systems were shutting down a lot of their lines while being given money buy new things. And we appealed to Congress that that was not the right approach to take. And I was really struck by the bipartisan response to that. They were really moved by the fact that essential workers need transit, whether you have the option to stay home or not, and by the fact that it just doesn't do you a whole heck of a lot of good to be able to drive yourself to the hospital if nurses and techs aren't there to take care of you. So it turns out transit dependency is universal at this point, and we need to respect that fact. And that really resonated. So I think that we have an opening to work with people on transit in a way that we really haven't before at the federal level in terms of the essential nature of transit to operate the economy going forward. The other area has been providing guidance for the operations of transit. And I'm afraid the CDC, the Centers for the Disease Control, have struggled a little bit there and continue to, being very much in a mode of responding to crisis and not thinking about a long-term approach. They at one point put out guidance that said everyone should drive themselves, and the world responded, oh, how delightful for those at the CDC that think that's a possibility for everyone, how very cute. And they rethought it and actually put out decent guidance that was much more inclusive and thoughtful, but they still have a long way to go. And really the leadership is coming out of the transit agencies themselves that are just trying to collaborate and try things and learn as best as they can, but we're not getting a lot of guidance out of the feds. In terms of trends for transit, it's really interesting because we often focus at the end output of what's happening, transit ridership, but it's informed by when people need to travel, and we don't have our arms around travel needs at this point. Many of us are staying home because either we are unemployed or we are teleworking and our offices are closed. Many of us are staying home because it's summer and there are no summer camps for our kids. And many of us are recognizing that our kids will not be going back full time in the fall. Washington, D.C., the most that they are considering is having half the kids back at school at one time. So I will not be deciding not to take transit. I will not be traveling. And so there's broader economic issue feeds into transit, but we don't want to get so absorbed with the impacts on transit that we forget that this is affecting a whole lot of industries and it's a much bigger societal issue, and that transit is a means to an end, not the end itself. I will point out that if we want the economy to function, we will have transit operating. There's a lot of people who before this
I just lost her. There.
So sorry.
Okay.
There are a lot of people who were $400 away from an economic crisis before COVID. They've experienced that crisis at a much larger rate, which means there will be more people that need transit. And if we want the economy to function, we need all of those folks to be able to get to jobs. So we're going to take this seriously. The final issue that I want to point out is there's a lot going on at the federal level in transportation. Last week, there was a 2 full day markup in Transportation Infrastructure Committee of a proposal for a transportation reauthorization bill that included some pretty big changes in the approach to transportation, including a significant increase in funding for transit programs and an attempt to focus on rewarding broader transit service rather than just population. Now, there's been some pushback on that about whether that not they got it right, but the intent is to reward those who provide more service rather than those who keep their costs down by providing less service to a large population. And the goal is the right one. And I think there will be work with them to make sure that the goal is met in the best possible way. There's also there was an amendment effort that will go to the floor introduced by Representative Chuy Garcia of Chicago calling for transit parity. The history of the program starting in 1982 was that when President Reagan was seeking to raise the gas tax to keep the program afloat, he needed support from urban House representatives, and there were a lot of folks that were concerned that raising the gas tax would only support highways in rural areas, and they wanted to make sure some of that money would come to them, and they argued for a transit title, which they got. They were guaranteed 1 penny of the increase in gas taxes, and 4 pennies would go to highways. Well, that was a deal in 1982, and it's the last time a lot of urban representatives asked for much at the federal level, and it remains the case today, nearly 40 years later. Representative Garcia is saying we can mess with that. The gas tax isn't paying for the program. It wasn't paying for it before COVID. It's definitely not paying for it now. And he wants to see transit have a much bigger role going forward than it has as kind of the forgotten part of the program in the past. So that's kind of the overview. There's a lot of opportunity to engage and push this debate going forward.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks for that overview. Very helpful and quick history lesson. That's great. And now I'm going to turn it over to Joe McAndrew from the Greater Washington Partnership to talk a little bit about the business perspective. And, you know, this is so important to businesses and to restarting our economy. So Joe, take it away and explain a little bit what you see happening and where businesses are coming on.
Perfect. Brooke, thank you very much for hosting this. And it's good to see so many friends on the virtual panel and also in the room here today. I put a few links in the chat. If anybody has a few hours and wants to review them, feel free. But you know, a quick overview of the blueprint, or sorry, the Greater Washington Partnership, and then why transit matters to employers in the capital region from Baltimore to Richmond. So the Greater Washington Partnership is a civic alliance comprising the leading CEOs stretching from Baltimore to Richmond. That geographic footprint represents the 3rd largest economy in the U.S. and the 7th largest in the world. And if we can link up our assets, we can be competitive, unlike many others. The challenge is that we've got a very disaggregated jurisdictional divide oftentimes that get in the way. I know Regina feels that at WMATA on a regular basis. But, you know, if we can connect and better match our transportation system and you know, better connect employees to opportunity, we've got an opportunity to make sure everybody can access our economy and prosper, and we'll be more competitive as a result. You know, there's some certain facts that we just need to acknowledge too. You know, every day, nearly 20% of our residents wake up in one jurisdiction and go to work crossing a state border, and nearly 50% cross a county border. And oftentimes those trips aren't planned, and it limits the ability for employers to connect to a deeper and wider and more diverse labor pool. And it makes it more challenging for them to want to grow in this region, and they might look elsewhere. You know, as our region continues to grow in terms of vehicle congestion, we need to be looking at alternatives to make sure that everybody can access jobs and essential destinations so that we can thrive. You know, to that end, we were formed in 2016. We set out our first endeavor was to create what we call the Blueprint for Regional Mobility. It's the first link in the chat. At the geographic scale that we're talking about, there's no one state or metropolitan planning organization or jurisdiction that really plans for that region. So we can't necessarily pick up one plan or one project and call it our initiative. We worked for 2 years engaging a broad set of stakeholders, from advocates to business leaders to transportation professionals, learning what were on the plans and what the game-changing opportunities were. If we could go ahead and make sure that we were aligned behind a few set of core initiatives, we could go ahead and reduce congestion, improve access, and better compete in the global economy. So to that end, you know, it set out 7 solution areas, 20 specific actions, and many other next move recommendations that I pester Brooke and Regina and others on a regular basis, trying to make sure we're moving forward. But you know, at the end of the day, we looked at everything from roadways to trails to transit to governance and funding and equitable access. You know, transit, to the specific question, why transit's important for employers, it's because this is a key driving asset for them to be able to access a wide set of talent. If you look at Northern Virginia, most employers are locating within a half mile of a metro station. And that's not to say that all of their employees drive, but for a certain subset of their employees, the folks that they're trying to attract, the young millennials, many of them are taking WMATA service or county bus operations to be able to access destinations. And it also opens the door for a wider set of incomes and a race to be able to access these destinations if they don't have access to a vehicle, or they opt not to have access to a vehicle. And that's the opportunity that transit provides, and that's what many employers are looking to. I mean, Amazon is one that maybe we're a little tired of pointing to, but they chose a very transit-rich area to locate. It's at the center of many commuter rail lines, Amtrak lines, and transit lines, and an airport. It's a multimodal access point for thousands of residents in all 3 jurisdictions. And that kind of gets at the crux of what's the opportunity. And if we cannot look at maintaining the service that we have today and growing where we need to, we've got challenges. And to that end, you know, at the regional level, we've really kind of honed in on 3 areas in Baltimore, in particular in the Baltimore metro area. One is the regional transportation transit plan, which Celeste is going to chat a bit about, I believe, as well. But Baltimore hasn't had a long-range transit plan for many years. And if we don't have a plan, it's going to be hard to execute. So getting that right and making sure that we're growing the system and connecting folks from where they live to where they need to go is going to be really important to make it for a more competitive transit system. And then on top of that, we need to make sure that our transit amenities, our transit stations where people get on and off, are transit-oriented development rich areas. I'm pointing to Northern Virginia as these stations that are taking off, or Washington, D.C. We just don't have great examples in the state of Maryland. And so looking at ways to partner with local jurisdictions who can control the land use, provide the right type of incentives and opportunities, and really focusing in on creating a vision and then executing on those visions at our stations are important. We're working currently with County Executive Pittman and County Executive also Brooks to help them think through strategies to enhance their TOD plans at a few rail assets.
That's great.
Yeah, and then finally, you know, we've got to work at the federal level. So we've been working in the Metro Civic Leadership Alliance here. You can see is a group of similar roundtables throughout the country of CEO-led groups that are coming together because the importance of getting the right federal program that enables us to compete, that puts the investments in the right places, multimodal access and connectivity is really important. So we've been pushing for many of the things that Beth highlighted, that Regina advocates for at the federal level. And I think that's important because it takes a village to move this transportation system forward. And the business community is a vested stakeholder, not the only one, but a vested stakeholder. We need to make sure that we're partnering with folks to push these investments forward and make sure that the right plans are in place so that we can thrive and prosper.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks for all your work. It's a lot. And now excited to turn it over to Dr. Chavez. Celeste has a lot to say and has worked in many different avenues on transit, from looking at how our students in Baltimore City access transit to systems and equity. So I'll let you take it away and talk to us about what you're seeing in terms of from where you sit today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I was going to keep my remarks pretty short because I was pretty excited from the questions that was received by our audience. So as a researcher, I kind of tend to focus a lot on the trends that we're seeing and kind of asking questions about why those trends are occurring, which I don't necessarily have the answers to the whys just yet, but I do think there's some really interesting trends occurring in public transportation, and Baltimore is pretty unique in what we've been seeing during COVID in terms of ridership compared to some of our neighboring places like WMATA, which we'll hear more about shortly. So just briefly, for example, MTA rail has dropped in ridership about 90% since February to April, whereas our fixed bus service is only dropped around 50%. If you compare that to some of the neighboring places, bus for like WMATA was, I think, in the 80% range, and Philly, when it's been as low, it was like 90% decrease in ridership. And I think that really highlights the importance of public transportation to the Baltimore region by the fact that we haven't seen as critical of a drop in ridership as what's been seen in other jurisdictions across the country. And I think some of that has to do with our workforce. We have a very healthy hospital industry here in Baltimore. And I know we hear so much about our brave doctors and nurses who are on the front lines, but there's so much support staff that also goes with that industry, right? So we have, you know, your hospitality workers, your maintenance workers, so much support staff. And I was looking at some statistics from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and about 4% of our workforce is hospital support staff in the Baltimore region. And they're at an average wage rate of around $16 an hour. So that really highlights kind of the importance of all types of essential workers and making sure that they have mobility and are able to access their critical jobs. And so it'll be really interesting to see how other places kind of bounce back in ridership compared to other regions, and who kind of gets back to what was considered normal before coronavirus started. There's also been some really interesting trends in terms of the use of more privately provided transportation, like e-scooter usage and bike shares across the country, and how some of their declines hasn't been as sharp as public transit systems. So for me, some of the interesting things will be, what is the way forward? How can transit agencies kind of adjust as ridership does increase? So far, there doesn't seem to be much evidence that public transit has been like an incubator of passing coronavirus, which is good, but the question will be, is that because of the really steep drops that we've seen in ridership? For the Baltimore area, of course, the student transportation problem is near and dear to my heart, and it will be interesting if schools open back up, how can we accommodate that huge influx of people and riders that are students, and they have to bring back whatever they're exposed to back to their families. So I guess I leave with some data and maybe even some questions, but I think it'll be really interesting to see how transit changes over time, and how Baltimore seems to be kind of an anomaly compared to a lot of the systems we see across the country.
Thanks for that. Appreciate that. Those are some great points. And now I'm going to share the screen because Regina has some, let's see, slides. So I'm going to turn it over to Regina Sullivan to talk about WMATA and the work that they are doing. Thanks.
Thank you, Delegate Marilyn, and thank you for the opportunity. I also want to thank you for your leadership on transit issues across the state of Maryland. We're very grateful for your support and for your staff and all the assistance you give us all the time, so thank you very much. And I want to thank my colleagues who are here. Joe and Beth, who I work with a lot, and Dr. Chavez, who I'd like to get to know a bit more, and I'm very excited about being able to be with all of you today. And I'm the outlier here. I have a few slides. So I'm going to try and go through them relatively quickly. Whoops. I'll get right to it. So I want to talk about, obviously I'm the operations person on the panel. And so I do want to talk about what we're doing in Metro on our recovery, to put together our recovery update. I think it's important that we focus on right now and the next year or so, and then we, as everyone else has talked about too, what we see for the future. But setting the table right now is going to make a big difference on how we recover. So we're focused on supporting the region's reentry and earning the public trust, which is so important on bus and rail travel are both safe. We have 3 goals that, with our leadership of our board and our general manager, Paul Wiedefeld, put in place throughout the pandemic, and that is to protect our employees first, protect our customers, and then stay ahead of demand. Pay attention to what the region is telling us and stay ahead of demand. This is a busy slide that talks about our multi-phased approach that we've taken as part of our recovery plan. Obviously, we're in a stabilization part right now, where we still have some less stay-at-home orders, but we're starting to move into our managed reentry. The region's now entered phase 2 in this area, all of our regions, with the recent change by Mayor Bowser to this week to phase 2. So we are now paying attention to and watching what's going on trend-wise through that. Then we obviously move into, we hope, the recovery phase, and I'm going to detail this a little bit more in the calendar just later in the slides. And that'll be obviously as we hopefully have a vaccine or more effective treatments for the virus. And so I want to go back to our first goal, which is protecting our colleagues, our employees, our amazing frontline employees. We have 12,300 employees about right now at Metro. We have 163 confirmed cases of COVID amongst our colleagues. 113 have returned to work. Currently, none are hospitalized, and blessedly, we've had no fatalities at Metro. We have, at any time, and this is one of the challenges around providing service, we have 400 or so employees who are quarantined as a result of exposure. And so that also affects our ability to provide service. Some of the things we've done, like a lot of others, but to protect our frontline employees and to protect all of our employees are obviously those of us who are fortunate enough to be able to work from home, like I am. And then social distancing. If you've been on a Metro bus recently, you can see the social distancing requirements we put in place between our operators and our customers. We've gone to a very intense cleaning protocols, which are guided by our pandemic task force and the Centers for Disease Control. I'm going to talk a little bit more about them shortly. And then obviously we're providing protective equipment to our frontline employees. And I have to say, we've done this all very much. Have a wonderful leadership, union leadership in Ray Jackson, our ATU, our largest union, and they've been a tremendously a big part of this and the reason why it's working so effectively. Then the next would be, oops, yeah, sorry. So, yeah, no, that's good. Thank you. I don't know, I'm sorry. Thanks, Brooke. The next slide, I'm good. So then obviously the next, I want to talk just very briefly about our customers. They're our most important stakeholders. And so we've been doing some surveys kind of on an ongoing basis, which we have a research office at Metro, and they do some great survey work, and they use all kinds of tools to reach out to our customers. You can't use just one tool, as you all know, to do that. So this is just some of the information that we learned when we surveyed our customers in May. And back then, only 1 in 5 were planning to return to work before August. And importantly, we were trying to get information on what would make them feel more comfortable requiring face coverings. We have required wearing face coverings on Metro, and they want to see obviously more cleaning. And so those are protocols that we've put in place. So that's on the rail side. On the bus side, and which next, I think that's all right. Thank you. So on the bus side, as Dr. Chavez said, our ridership on bus has fallen dramatically, but our ridership on bus has been really the stalwart of getting essential workers and for essential trips. And here's this just to demonstrate on our surveys, 89% of the customers said they took essential trips for food, to grocery shop, to go to the pharmacy, critically to go to work, and for medical appointments. And so our bus service has, even though it's fallen, it has still been really where our riders have stayed. And so we wanted to make sure that through a number of different techniques, we had captured that information. And we also, bus riders are not any different on rail riders, and they want to see face coverings, and they want to see the work around the protocols for cleaning. And so that's information we receive from our customers that helps inform us on how we're going to put together service. And we put together service as we work through the different phases. And importantly also is our outreach to our employers. And I want to thank Joe McAndrew and the Greater Washington Partnership, which has been tremendously helpful. We've also worked with, and the partnership is part of this also too, a very large group that was put together of academics of the universities, nonprofit organizations across our region, government entities, our Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, really an amazing consortium to help, and Paul Wiedefeld is leading our effort there to help with getting information from employers on what they need and how they're going to bring employees back and when they're going to bring their employees back and what we needed as a region to do. that's been very, very productive for us. We're also working with our chambers across Maryland, Virginia, and obviously in the district. So I don't want to fail to mention all those stakeholders. And then just real quickly on operations recovery. So this is a picture of, obviously, one of our folks who, our staff who is cleaning the train. We're doing the same kind of trick cleaning on buses, focusing on buses, facilities, all the high-touch areas, using disinfectants. We're also using, as it says here, the electrostatic fogger for COVID-19 presumptive positive incidents. When we have an incident in the station, we have an incident on the bus, we use that to make sure it's thoroughly clean. And then we're looking at investigating other long-term chemicals we could use, obviously complying with EPA, and working with our pandemic task force and our medical team at Metro. We have procured personal protective equipment for our employees so that they are safe. We have required them, as I've said a couple times, and we will have, if our riders don't have face coverings, we will be able to hand them one so that we can minimize the disruption there. Social distancing, I just want to say right now, Beth alluded to it earlier, it is very difficult, and we've told our customers that it's going to be a challenge when it's crowded on the trains for us to do that. So we all want to make sure we're messaging and make sure the face coverings are going to be so important. That's it on the operation phase. And then this is our service planning. We're in the stabilization phase. We did do a couple of things this week. I just want to mention we had closed the first 8 cars to protect our employees. They're still, our operators are still protected in their own part of the vehicle, of the cars, but we did reopen those to provide more trains so that when we had the peaceful protests recently and obviously ongoing in our region, there was more opportunity to be distant when people were traveling. And then we also opened our 15 closed stations. We announced that yesterday and the other requirements. And then the next one talks about the increase in availability of service that we expect to have this fall. We're following the region, following what's going on, but we expect to put that in place and hopefully be in the recovery phase by next spring. And then I just wanted very quickly to just say we are so fortunate, our congressional delegation and all the leadership provided the CARES Act funding, which has been critical to our being able to continue. And I know MTA also, we worked with MTA on this too. We thank them for their support of help with the CARES Act funding. That we've been able to cover the cost associated with this and also the massive revenue losses that we're seeing at Metro. I guess on the good news side, our capital program is on track to spend the $1.8 billion. We have been able to take advantage of low ridership in some areas to do some very critical safety work. So that's some of the good news coming out of that. And we're going to continue that work, obviously, moving forward. And this last slide, I won't go in detail. This is already some of the things just so you get a sense of it. It ends in September, but I don't mean to do that because we're looking forward to continuing the work so that, as I said, hopefully by next spring or so, we'll be back. We were at Metro having historic ridership numbers, especially on the rail side. So we'd like to remind everybody that we'd like to get back there too. So, and thank you for all your support. I'll shut up now and answer some questions.
No, this is great. Thank you. That was excellent. Great information for everybody. There's our contact information. I'm going to stop this for a little bit so we can go to questions because there were so many great questions that people sent in. There's no way we're going to get to all of them, but it was great to see them. So Regina, while you're talking, maybe just say one thing about the evidence that is emerging from other countries that transit is just not a significant source for transmission, and that as long as people wear masks, keep to themselves, wash their hands after riding, it seems that riding transit is a relatively low risk activity. Have you seen evidence of that in the US? And if so, how is that informing your messaging about riding transit, and how should it inform MTA and other transit agencies, and how should we all spread the word too?
Sure, and I appreciate that. We are obviously, our pandemic task force, which is led by our chief safety officer and our chief medical officer, are the ones who indicated we would make that assessment. It does look from the information coming from Japan and South Korea and other countries that transit doesn't appear to be a big transmitter of the virus, but we are reminding people that they need to wear face coverings and that we'll continue the extensive cleaning. There are the CDC recommendations around social distancing, which, as we said, is very difficult. So that's why it's so important to us. The message we got from our customers loud and clear was make sure you do that so we do feel safe getting back on public transit. But we'll be watching those very closely, and obviously, as we go through this, have more information about that ourselves.
Brooke, I'd also like to add that, this is going to be a broader issue than just transit. I don't really see a world where people are super excited to go to crowded bars, but transit's where they draw the line. Or they go to crowded restaurants, but not transit, or they get in public pools, but not transit. I mean, the deal is if people find transit uncomfortable, that means that there's going to be a broader discomfort that's affecting the majority of our economy. And I think we all, those of us that obsess about transportation, I know why we're obsessed here, but we do need to recognize that this is going to be part of much broader trends. I can tell you personally, as someone who is immunosuppressed, when I first started taking the medicine for this, I had to think about this in all places, going to the grocery, getting on transit. But I figured it out, and it's actually great to have the majority of the country concerned about these things, because you're doing a lot now that you didn't do before that's helping to keep me safe, and I really appreciate that. But there's a wealth of information for those of people like me who have dealt with this in the past that can be utilized now.
That's helpful. Thanks. I just can see it being sort of one of those things that opponents of transit and opponents of people who, want to invest in transit throw out there as, well, we don't need to invest in transit now because everybody should be driving, because it's, so I think it's up to everybody on this call to really push back against that and to lead with the facts, especially in light of the fact that our essential workforce has been so reliant and is so reliant on transit. And that should be centered in this discussion as well. I mean, gosh, just look at Hong Kong. They have a huge transit system and they had almost no cases. So it's not transit. So a couple of questions about policy and advocacy and vision, our vision going forward. So what do you think, and I'll turn this over to anybody who wants to answer, what do you think should be the top priority, one or two priorities for regional transit advocates for the next 12 to 18 months? What do you think is achievable given the current environment? Anybody want to take that on?
Sure, I will. All the rules are broken. Everything's achievable. Nothing applies anymore. I don't think we should start by self-limiting. In fact, I would suggest that we need to push much harder against the old rules. I was just noticing that my friend Jeff Davis, who is the Uber transportation geek, on whom anyone that needs to know anything about federal transportation budgeting goes to, including the U.S. Department of Transportation, saying that no states are paying in more than they get back now. The trust fund is completely busted. With a completely busted trust fund, the old rules revolving around a trust fund don't make sense. The old rules about what portion transit get doesn't make any sense. It is the income taxes and customs taxes and everything like that paying for transportation at this point. So look, we're heading into a possible stimulus conversation. And one of the things I think we should all prepare for is, what do we want to accomplish in it? Not what piece of a funding pie do we want to spread money around so we all feel comforted, but what do we want to accomplish as a nation? Much like what happened during the Great Depression with FDR, where he said, I want to electrify rural America, for example. In transit, what do we want to do? We want all Americans to have access to what percentage of jobs by transit? Like, let's start really setting those and thinking about the opportunity in that way. And I just challenge people to think big.
Build better. Don't rebuild. Build better. Yes.
Yeah, Beth is always going to pick you up, and I love working with her on this one. I will say these projects that we're talking about some days of the week don't take a lot of time. Fixing the bus and improving its speed and efficiency, we can do that overnight by just dedicating a little bit of right of way. Mayor Bowser down in the district, was it last summer, was out painting red paint one weekend, and the next Monday you have a dedicated strip on some of the most congested roads in downtown DC for buses to ultimately be able to run. So it doesn't cost that much to ultimately provide better bus service. Now rail, those take generations to get done. We need to stay consistent and not lose focus. We might get a little bit delayed because the funding and financing might get slipped up if we can't get that big stimulus taken care of. But at the end of the day, the issue about transit and the connectedness in these plans, they shouldn't go on the shelf just because we have a 1 or 2 year blip, right? We should stay consistent and predictable and prioritize our investments and plans to make sure that we're there and ready when a stimulus shows up, but ultimately making sure that we're doing the hard work today to make sure that we're ready to improve the system for tomorrow.
And just real briefly, I would also add that one of the things that we've seen during this time is how important public transit is. And even though we have all of this new variety of privately provided services that do serve a critical role in our transportation landscape, they have not been a substitute for the critical need of public transit. And I think that's one thing that we can definitely see out of this, even just with the layoffs with some of our major, you know, Lyft and ride hailing companies. Like, they're very susceptible to, you know, changes in the economy. And no matter what types of developments we have on the private sector side, public transportation still has a very important role to fill.
And Delegate, if I could just add one, thank you. If I could just add one last thing and then we can get to the next question. I do agree we need I agree with Beth, we need to think broader than just what do we do with the money. But I do have to say, from the Metro perspective, and you know this from all your good work in Annapolis, especially in dedicated funding, we are really working hard to restore the rail system to state of good repair and improve safety, obviously, and make it state of the art. And also, but are also working very hard for our bus transformation project, which we spent a year and a half doing to improve our bus system, and also to make sure we take care of the infrastructure around buses, Joe said, creating dedicated lanes, but taking care of our 103-year-old bus garages. You know, the capital dollars that matter, that make a difference in being able to provide bus service all across the region that we provide service for. So those I have to be parochial there. Those are very important to us at Metro.
Yeah, no, hugely important. I mean, I think hugely important. And I think, you know, I think it'll be interesting too to see how the lack of funding in the Transportation Trust Fund translates into a renewed push for changes in governance and changes in funding structures. So whether MTA, you know, right now WMATA is paid a grant from the state, from the Transportation Trust Fund and from the general fund, whereas MTA simply shares in the pie of the Transportation Trust Fund. And, you know, does it make sense that maybe MTA should have a separate fund from the Transportation Trust Fund and have dedicated funding, and then it could take in federal money that way straight from FTA? You know, I mean, I think we're going to have to look at different models for funding and for making sure that we're capturing that funding. And of course, WMATA and MTA are going to need to do what they can to be generating dollars as well, right? Whether that's selling ad space or building green buildings to recapture dollars, or, you know, whatever it is, that's an important component of this.
We're looking forward to start taking out. We would love to take any advertising anyone asks for.
Yes, yeah. So, you know, I think there are different ways, but no, thank you for that. All those great points. So questions about sort of how our transportation system creates or furthers racial inequality and inequity. You know, I think this is a great question. We could do an entire webinar on it, but let's just talk about it for a little bit in light of the amazing protesting and demonstrations that have been happening, and the Black Lives Matter movement more broadly. You know, we, several years ago when the Red Line was canceled, there was a Title VI complaint filed. But I think even broader than that is how our transit system continues to perpetuate the silos in the neighborhoods and keeps neighborhoods apart rather than connecting them. So I would love to hear thoughts on, you know, what are some of the biggest ways that our transportation system creates or furthers racial inequality? And that was a 3 people asked that question. So I wanted to get it out and make sure that folks can share their thoughts on how we can build an equitable system that's connecting people and jobs.
So there's a lot there.
Yeah, big topic.
You know,
sorry.
I think at the end of the day, it's the question of what you're measuring and what you're trying to prioritize. And this is across all modes of transportation, because I think, you know, if you go to any urban area, there's probably a highway to nowhere that has scarred their community and still scars their community. And the question isn't, you know, once the community is scarred, how do you bring it back? It's hard. And so it's the question of what are your investments and how are you measuring it? I think MTA in Maryland is grappling with this right now as they work to finalize their regional transit plan. They're looking at equity, accessibility type of metrics, and the real question is who is it benefiting, right? Are you mapping that out and asking those questions and then prioritizing your investments to those communities that need it the most, or continuing the same pattern of investment that benefits those that have at the expense of those that don't have? And I think that's a big challenge. I don't think we're ripping through communities with new urban highways anytime soon, I hope. But the question is, how do we heal and improve on what we have before? And I'm just going to tee up my friend Beth real quick, because I think she worked on a really cool highway teardown project somewhere in the US that might be a good project for Baltimore to look at.
I've just shared a link to our discussion, my parent organization's discussion about transportation and equity. I will start with a personal story. I grew up in New Orleans. I went to school in Baton Rouge. I needed a job to help pay my bills while I was in school. I couldn't find a job that I could get to outside of a car, either by walking, biking, or transit, but I couldn't afford a car because I couldn't find a job, but I couldn't find a job because I couldn't afford a car. I did not grow up poor. I did not grow up lower middle class. That was a barrier to me, which spoke volumes about how little your work and your productivity is invited into our economy if you can't pay a huge cover charge. Now, if that is true for a white girl from a relatively well taken care of family, what is the challenge for those that did not have the opportunity and the funding I had from my parents growing up? We know that minority families are much less likely to have access to a vehicle, particularly for younger members of their family who are starting off and trying to establish themselves in a career path. We know that if they're going to college, are coming out with tons of debt. So that's eating up a lot of the capacity to get a car. So we really do need to think about these things. We also know that fatalities are increasing for bicyclists and pedestrians at a time where it's going down for people in an automobile, and that people of color are 7 times more likely to be killed as a bicyclist or a pedestrian than white people. We also know that fine particles from the transportation system impact neighborhoods of color to a much more significant percentage than white people, particularly Black Americans, due to the fact that we put high-speed roadways through minority neighborhoods, and that the underlying conditions that come from those fine particles have contributed to COVID morbidity. We know, I could go on in how our transportation system creates inequities, divides people from the things they need. My former boss, Secretary Anthony Fox, talked about growing up in a neighborhood that was separated from the job center by a highway. One of the things I think we should be thinking about for a reauthorization or for a stimulus package is a program specifically designed to address the scars of urban renewal, which was the code term for wiping out Black neighborhoods that we implemented for decades in this country. And I would actually disagree with Joe. We do have a long list of projects that are ready to do the same thing in the name of speeding people who are coming from the exurbs into job centers. It may not have the same intentionality, but it certainly isn't backed with any concern for it. So I think we need to look very deeply at the program. And I will just end with some good news. The House bill includes a provision that requires measuring access to jobs and access to services by all modes of travel for all metropolitan planning organizations and DOTs, with a specific look at non-driving modes. And I think just requiring people to look at that is going to change a lot in terms of what we prioritize, particularly because your funding programs cannot reduce that accessibility.
That's great. Good. That's good to hear. Any other thoughts? We have lots of questions. Okay. Like I said, we could do an entire webinar on that, and maybe someday we will. I like doing these webinars, so we'll see if I can get some of these panelists and others back. Questions about micromobility. There are a few questions about how does the pandemic affect the viability of microtransit? Any thoughts on that folks would like to share?
I mean, I can always talk. So go ahead. No, okay, go ahead.
Yes.
No, I mean, I think there's definitely potential for micromobility. I just read something very briefly about scooter use here in Baltimore and the equity zones where we've seen a lot less of a decline in scooter use in those areas as opposed to the overall area of Baltimore. So I do think it can definitely fill some of those gaps that we see that are created by the reliance of the automobile. So I think it has potential.
That's great. Thank you. And then I'm going to do one more question and then we'll do some closing remarks because gosh, it's already 2:55. So this is a loaded question because we are seeing what's happening with the purple line right now. But the question is, and I'm reading it verbatim, are P3s more important than ever with budget shortfalls as a result of the pandemic? I'm guessing that different people have different perspectives on transportation P3s. I, in light of what is happening with the purple line, have very strong opinions about transportation P3s that I'm not going to share right now because I'm here to have you all share your opinions and thoughts. But any thoughts on P3s going forward? Again, we could do an entire webinar on P3s, but interested in hearing your thoughts on this question from an audience member.
To answer the question in a nutshell, P3s are not a funding mechanism. They're a tool to deliver a project. And I think the question becomes, what are the goals that you're jumping through big hoops to engage a private partner to take on the risk and expect a decently high rate of return to take on that risk? And I think if we don't answer those questions and properly share and allocate those risks and be a consistent partner on both sides of the table, P3s are challenged. Doesn't matter where you're at or the project. Each project is different, of course, and the parties and partners are different. But you know, we at the partnership are cautiously hopeful that we don't delay the purple line too much longer, and that the governor and that the private contractors can reach agreement, and that we can deliver that in near-ish term.
Thank you. Any other thoughts? Okay. So I think it would be great to hear there's a final question and maybe a couple final comments based on this question from all of you. And that is, what have been the lessons learned that carry over from the shutdown going forward? And how can the transit industry leverage the challenges of COVID to come back stronger and more effective? So in your closing remarks, I'd love it if you could talk a little bit about that. Thank you.
I'll go first if that's okay. I think for us at Metro, obviously the lesson is the number one thing that we've learned is how incredibly fortunate we are to have the colleagues that we do who are on the front line every day providing transportation through this pandemic. I have to pay tribute to my colleagues who have done that. That's really it. We really feel that at Metro, and I hope that some of the things that we've talked about here today, and I really appreciate the opportunity, will help demonstrate to everyone who's listening that we are focused on making sure we provide safe and healthy transportation again, and how critical it is to the regions for all of the things that we've talked about here today. And I want to once again thank everyone participating, and I want to thank the leadership of our region for all of the support they provided. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you. Dr. Chavez?
I guess for me, I would just say that I think what we've seen right now puts Baltimore at a very good place to advocate for public transportation, just by seeing how unique we've been in terms of our trends compared to a lot of our neighboring cities. Provides a lot of leverage to advocate for why we need to have good, healthy transit in the region. And so I hope that by seeing the critical need that workers from all sorts of economic backgrounds are playing right now, that we can really advocate for equitable and good public transit in the region.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us. Beth?
Sure. I think that there are a few things that we can keep in mind. One is we've made a lot of progress at convincing people that transit is an essential part of the economy. It seems like the potential to lose transit got people to wake up, and that's not just in kind of the transit skeptical community who now have to acknowledge that, you know, you really don't have a functioning healthcare system without transit. You don't have a functioning supply chain and that sort of thing. But also from groups like climate advocates that had been in a position for years that we're just going to have everyone buy an EV and climate would be taken care of. They now kind of recognize that transit has to be part of it, and that there are folks that don't just get to go buy new vehicles all the time. But I also think that there's been some positive developments in how much transit has now focused on the non-work trip. We in transportation obsess over the work trip, which is 20% of our trips. It's 30% of our miles, but it's 20% of our trips. The overwhelming majority of our time is spent in other trips, and transit has adjusted to that, which is something that should have happened before and should happen in the overall transportation program. And I find that very hopeful for a stronger transit system. And the last thing I will mention is in the midst of the COVID shutdown, when people weren't taking transportation, we saw some regional ballot initiatives in places like Cincinnati that funded transit, new taxing for transit to expand transit, which shows that the public itself believes there will be a day where everyone is back on transit and where transit is an essential part of going forward and building an economy. So while we get nervous, we can take hope from the fact that the people who have been asked to tax themselves recognize that it's still worth it in spite of the current circumstances we find ourselves in.
Thank you. Joe, last word.
I'll echo what everybody else said and just, you know, highlight the power of the bus. I think oftentimes we don't, our politicians oftentimes overlook what the bus can and can't do. And at the end of the day, it's the workhorse of our transit system. It's connected folks to jobs and to grocery stores and to other key destinations like healthcare appointments during this time. And I think, you know, recognizing that and prioritizing its movements is going to be really important going forward. I don't think that is really set in. I think that there was in the urbanist movement a lot of folks that said, let's go out and just paint the lanes while there's no cars out here. And I don't know if that really sunk in with the elected officials. But at the end of the day, the bus kept us moving, kept connecting folks that were essential to jobs and to other destinations that they needed to go to. And I think if we can keep that front of mind, you know, of course, rail is important because it can move more people faster and connect them to a broader set of destinations. But the bus is the workhorse and we can't lose sight of it.
Thank you. A huge thank you to all of you for joining us today and for sharing your thoughts and for all the work that you do each and every day to help us build a more connected transportation system in the state of Maryland so that we can get to our jobs, but also get to our doctor's appointments and get to the grocery store and get to one another's neighborhoods so that we can be one state and, you know, be connected and thriving and prosperous. And I think it's very clear based on the comments today that it's time for everyone to keep going and keep fighting and make sure that we are funding and prioritizing our transit systems around the state of Maryland, because it's the only way that we will build better and not just rebuild. So a huge thank you to all of you for being here today. Thank you for everybody for joining us. And I look forward to continuing the conversation and continuing to work with all of you to create equitable and efficient and connected transit systems around the state. Thanks. Take care.
Thank you, Delegate Lehrman.
Bye-bye. Thank you.